everybody. I'm very happy to be your moderator for Ripple Effects, Race, Culture, and the Justice System, a discussion of how scripted series are depicting race, racism, and its intersection with the justice system. Before we get started, I want to thank Hollywood Health and Society, which I happen to be an advisory committee member for many years. Very proud to be associated with this organization. They have begun a strong effort to support BIPOC writers and encourage more nuanced stories of BIPOC characters and communities. And I wish you every success with that endeavor because you truly have been a wonderful organization. So now let's get to it and let's introduce our esteemed panelists. First, Elle Johnson is a very talented writer who has written on many shows that deal with the justice system: Bosch, Homicide, Life on the Street, Law and Order, CSI Miami, among others. She's also penned a memoir, The Officer's Daughter, which recounts the story of her cousin, who sadly was murdered at the young age of 15. Elle grew up in a criminal justice family with her father being a parole officer. Next, the amazing Tracy McMillan. Truly an accomplished writer with a variety of credits. Many may know her blog, Why You're Not Married, which for 2 years was the most popular, most viewed article on Huffington Post. She also wrote a book by the same name. Her many credits include Necessary Roughness, Chase, Life on Mars, The United States of Tara. She won the 2010 Writers Guild of America Award for Mad Men, along with the writing staff of that show. Currently, she is the creator of the new Hulu series, Unprisoned, which is a great show, and I'm thoroughly enjoying watching it. And we agree with Yvette, who I also love. And it's inspired by her relationship with her dad. Next, last but not least, we are thrilled to have another terrific writer join us for the panel, Kristi Korzec. Yay! Started her career in the very popular series Girlfriends. She's since written on such series as It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, Everyone Hates Chris, Madam Secretary, and currently the very popular Superman and Lois on the CW. And you're working with my friend Ritzy Tulloch, she's been at my house a number of times, and she's a lovely, lovely lady. So,
that's awesome.
Before we get to the subject at hand, I think we all, with such amazing people on this panel, I think we would all love to hear their individual journeys as writers. And so, can you tell us just a bit about that journey? Elle, you want to start us off?
Oh, wow. I'm not sure how to condense it, but as Bruce mentioned, I come from a law enforcement family, and I basically kind of pursued television writing, particularly cop shows, because of having a dad who was a parole officer, an uncle who was a homicide detective in Manhattan, and having this experience when I was 16 years old of having my 16-year-old cousin murdered in a Burger King robbery gone awry. She had her face blown off by a sawed-off shotgun, and it was front page news because her father was a homicide detective. And that experience really kind of influenced the rest of my life and my interest in telling stories about crime and criminal justice, and feeling that I really understood who cops were, but also feeling like I really wanted to understand how someone becomes a criminal and does these unspeakable things. And so that's kind of how I segued into writing for television, particularly working on cop shows for the majority of my career.
Well done. I started out in journalism. I worked in TV news for 16 years. Then how do you say it? I had a baby. I was in a band. Yeah, I started knitting. Which is to say that I gave myself the right to write a song, to put a thing out there, to be like, all right, here it is, judge. And there was definitely something about having a baby for me. I know this is like, how did I get here? That was really important because there was this moment. I always tell the story. There's this moment where everyone's like looking at you and you're like, oh, look at all these people. I'm like, every single thing I thought I was protecting like, oh, I have to look a certain way or people are going to judge me. I was like, oh, it doesn't matter. So that gave me, I was like 32. That gave me the right to say this or to do that or to fail or to sound dumb or to whatever, you know what I mean? All the things I was afraid of. I was like, oh, I've been seen, so who cares? And that's when that kind of really started my creative journey from being a person who wrote other people's stories for other people to a person who had authorship. I knew one person in the business. I said, how do you write TV? I've always sort of wanted to do that. She's like, well, everyone thinks they can do that. And I was like, okay, well, let me try. And she said, well, here's what you do. You have a character, they have a problem, they try to solve their problem, they get up a tree, they try to solve the problem again, they get further up the tree, they try to solve the problem again, and they fall out of the tree. And that's your structure. And I was like, okay. This was like in 2000, and I went off and I wrote a Drew Carey and a Dharma and Greg spec. And she read them, she's like, whoa. Now, I wish I could tell you that my career started. It didn't. 5 years passed, a whole bunch of things happened, life. And then I wrote this thing about the moment I was in my life. And all my best writing is about a moment I'm in my life, including Unprisoned. And by this time, she was like co-EP level. And I was like, hey, you want to read this thing? And she's like, no, I'm way too busy, sorry. But I will give it to my agent. If he likes it, he'll call you. And if he doesn't like it, he won't. And he called me 8 months later. And that is basically how I got started writing TV. And then I kind of went in and just, you have to learn the business, which is the whole other part. And that's basically how I became a writer.
Yeah. And Kristi, I forgot to say that your dad was a police officer as well. So all three of these ladies have touched the social justice system, the justice system. Period.
Yeah, my stepdad was a Baltimore City police officer and sergeant, and what's funny is my biological dad was sort of a con man. So I got both sides.
Your mom has a type.
That's right. And it has all helped me with my career and writing. So, we moved around a lot when I was a kid. I was mostly with my mom, and so all I wanted was stability. I would write for fun, but I went to Johns Hopkins undergrad. I was going to be a doctor. I could see that future laid out. And then I just got so burnt out that I took a semester of writing where I jammed in all my humanities. And I called my mom and I was like, I think I'm going to be a writer. And she was like, thank goodness. Because she always knew, but I was desperate for a path that I could see because we moved around so much. But a part of that moving around led us to, I spent a lot of time in like comedy clubs when I was a kid, and a bunch of those comedy writers became TV writers. So I knew it was a career. I knew it was a thing, but none of those guys looked like me. They were white, just white dudes. And they would send me scripts to read. And I guess my mom was sending them my writing, which I never knew because, again, it wasn't the path I was on. And so when I changed my direction, a family friend, well, actually I took a detour. I got engaged, worked in his family's Greek restaurants. I took care of my mom who was sick and had a full other life, which I think is something I tell people who want to get into writing is don't just go from film school to Hollywood, have a full life, because that's really what we want in the writer's room. So I had this whole other life. And then my mom was like, our friend is working on a show. He doesn't think it's going to last, but you should come out and kind of get a crash course in writing. And or a crash course in TV making. And it doesn't mean that I came out and got a job. He just got me an interview to be a production assistant. And I got it. And that's where I first started learning. And it was on HBO's Entourage. And that was just Hollywood in your face. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is what it's like. But I also was like, this is comedy? I can write this. Wrote my first Entourage spec. And I was I was audacious enough to give it to my boss. And he was like, no, I don't know I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't think you're a writer. But my friend gave it to his agent. And his agent was like, this is a great Entourage script. And I got hip pocketed from there. And so through this very weird path, I ended up getting hip pocketed, which just means that they're not representing you, but they're kind of waiting for you to get your own job, and then they'll decide if they'll represent.
10%.
Exactly.
It is one of the most
Exactly.
annoying things in this industry. I'll put you in my hip pocket until you actually make it, and then I'll represent you
That's
and
right.
take your money.
That's
yeah,
right.
thank you.
Yes. But it worked out after lots of assistant work. I had a very long path of just working and assisting, but I also got a great education doing that, and eventually I was staffed. So that's my story.
And all of your stories are great stories. This business is tough. We all know it, and especially for people of color. And I'm sure as people of color, as women of color, you have faced challenges in the writer's room. And I'm wondering if you can just share a little bit of some of those challenges that you've had to face, often being probably the only person in the room.
Yeah, I will say, frequently on procedurals, cop shows, I was often the only woman in the room and the only person of color. And I feel like I would get hired because they would say, oh, well, we have a female character or there's a black character on the show, so we want your voice there. It was very overtly like you are being hired because you are a black woman, and that's the expectation. But what's always so interesting, being a black woman in America and kind of being on the margins, I have to understand the majority culture. So I felt like I really understood white men in a way that they didn't understand themselves, because I had to study them to get along with them, and also having the law enforcement background of my family and kind of that dual perspective of black men in law enforcement and having to understand kind of both sides of that coin because of it. But my experience was always that I would get in these rooms where I would frequently be the only person like myself, and having to stand up for my perspective or the other perspective. And with my backstory, often also feeling like, look, if we're going to do stories about criminals of a certain ilk, we should look into their backgrounds as well. Like, why do people act the way they do? It's not just a blanket, they're a bad guy, they're a criminal, and that's it. It's like, there's got to be a motivation as well. And so I feel like my background kind of contributed to that, but also put me in a position where I had to make sure that I was always representing and not being afraid to speak up, and not stopping myself from speaking up, so that the stories that I wanted to tell could be told as well.
Tracy.
Yeah, I would say, one of the things about the writers' rooms I've been in, I'm trying to think, I can't count every room, but one of the more remarkable things is that I'm usually in a room with another black person, and exactly right. And you're like, that's a testament to the showrunners I've worked with, that I have usually not been the only black person in the room. But what I will say, the real challenge for me was, I was a diversity hire, but I did staff writer 5 times. Mm-hmm. And it took me, and then I took the most challenging show I was ever on. I'm not going to say which one it was, but Bruce did read the name of it.
Which one was it?
Even when you say it, I'm like, no, don't guess. No. Because I have so much respect for everyone I've worked with, honestly, even the terrible people. I'm like, you know what? It was all part of the thing. But I took that job. It wasn't the right job for me, but I took that job because they were going to make me a story editor. And I wanted to get paid for a script. And I'd been on 4 or 5 shows. It was my 5th show.
When you're a staff writer, you don't get paid for your script.
You don't get paid for your scripts. And I think that's one of the things that we're trying to change in the writer's strike. So it was very difficult to get to the next level. That was very, very hard. Now, I will say, I'm a lucky lady in the sense that when I did get a show on the air in year 16, I was ready. It is not like, because, in peak TV, you've got so many people getting shows very early on. I remember going to a premiere once, and the creator got up and said, when I started this process, I'd never even written an outline. And I'm like, That sounds hard because it's hard enough if you don't know what you're doing and other people can whatever. So I would say that the diversity hire thing was probably, obviously I'm grateful, but it was also like, it was like being, south of the 10. You know what I mean? I was not getting, it took a long time and it was very frustrating and difficult, but we got there.
Yeah. I had a similar experience. I was a staff writer on a few shows because of very grateful for the diversity hiring program. However, once they get to a point of, we actually have to pay this writer, you go from, these are my friends, this is my family, my show family, to we can no longer afford to have you. And then you are just stuck, and the next job will offer you staff writer again. And it really is, it's just like, am I not good enough to be hired as a paid writer, or one that has to actually come out of the show's budget? And finally, I did make my way up to like story editor. And then that show got canceled. And then the next show, which I was so excited for, and I knew the showrunner and all this stuff, he was like, we can only afford to pay you staff writer. And I was like, no! And it was a black showrunner and a black show. And I'm not going to say what it was, but it killed me, and I didn't take it. And then I didn't work for a while, and I was like, oh no! But then it did work out. I just like, it's just one of those things. It does kick you sometimes. And and I would call my agents, I'm like, I am a woman of color. People like me. Yeah. Why aren't I like out there? But it is. And most of the beginning for sure, I worked in comedy a lot. I was often the only woman, the only person of color. And it's a mix. It's like, you've got to stand up for people of color everywhere, and you're also being looked to represent people of color everywhere, and you've had your experience. And it's like, how am I the face of everyone? And especially when, like, I think black men are like somehow the Swiss Army knife of writing. Like, they're like, I can write for black people, I can write for Asian people, I can write for everyone. But when it comes to black writers, it's like, oh no, we have a black character, we need a black writer. And it's like, no, I can write for white men too. And a good portion of my career was writing for white men, which was exciting because I'm like, haha, here I am. Look out, black. And so, it's been an interesting experience.
Yeah, no, I completely understand that. And for those folks who don't understand in terms of the diversity staff writing position, it was all the networks in an effort to increase diversity on staffs, created programs where they would pay for a diversity staff writer on the staff of the show, which in its idea is a good thought, but unfortunately, what often would happen as the writers would want to move up, and it should move up, the networks would only pay the amount of money for a diversity staff writer, and there's a certain amount of money for that. And so once writers started to raise, that meant that the show had to pay the difference between what the network would pay and the rest would have to come out of the show's budget. And that's when one of the most frustrating things of my career would happen, because so many times these showrunners would say, we can't afford to pay that small difference. Yeah. And it was just incredibly frustrating, and I often tried to fight that fight at my network. But it's I also can feel for the longest time when I started my career, believe it or not, this obviously was many years ago when it was just Fox, ABC, CBS, and NBC. But for the longest time, I was the only black man at any of those networks in programming. So for multiple years, it was just me. And being that only person in the room, being asked to speak for all black people, it's a very, very tough position. And I know that so many of you were put in that same position too. And it's just, it's really rough. But we have survived, we have endured, and now we can kind of hopefully bring others up along and give them the guidance and mentorship that they so readily deserve.
I want to just say something off of that, because when you are the only person in that room, I think a lot of times you feel like you have to get it right. Like you have to that there's only one, perspective, or that you have to get the issue said properly. And I had to finally let go of that and get to a point where it's like, you know what, this is crazy for me too. Like sometimes I'm mad at y'all and sometimes I agree with you. And sometimes, it's like I have a different perspective given whatever the issue is. And so it may seem like I'm schizophrenic, but this is just the reality of being a person of color in America, that there's so many different ways that you can feel about things. And by the end of my career, I worked in a show where one of the writers said to me, he said, you have a remarkable willingness to be difficult in the room. And I was at once kind of insulted, but also kind of like, yeah, that's right. I do. I'm going to be difficult. So that's kind of your problem, not mine.
I'm with you. Okay, so all three of you have insight into the justice system as a result of your backgrounds. And I'm wondering if you can give us some insight into how that has, and obviously Tracy, and we'll talk more specifically about your show, but how that insight has played into your writing over the years. And that obviously with your procedurals, that has definitely come into play.
Yeah. I mean, and also it's interesting. Being the daughter of someone in law enforcement, I felt like one of the shows I really enjoyed writing for was Bosch, because of the relationship Bosch has with his daughter, Maddie. I felt like that was something that I could really explore in more and deeper detail. But I definitely, in many ways, am still working out all of those kind of childhood issues and trying to explore, themes of law enforcement and how that affected my father as a Black man, and how that trickled down to me as a family member. And so I feel like just my background really lent itself to looking into law enforcement stories in a different way.
I mean, I don't know. Somebody said to me early on, you have to write what only you can write. Then my joke is, but first you're going to write on some cop shows, okay? Because you have a kid and he wants to eat and go to school. So that was it. But in the back of my mind, I always knew. I wrote a spec early on called Life After Life about a version of Unprisoned. It was a version of Unprisoned. So I just knew that I had a lot to explore around my dad being in prison and the way it impacted my relationships with men. And, I'm still working on that. It's been an arc and really Unprisoned. So I'd written it over the years in various ways. Like sometimes if I were pitching to a network, I would be like, yeah, I'm going to make this. Because for a while there, I was every year. It's kind of like the way your year is structured is you sort of staff on someone else's show and then you develop your own show in the other 6 months of the year, just roughly. And so somebody would come to me and be like, yeah, we want to do, it was always like a 29-year-old Black woman does blank, right? They're like, a 29-year-old Black woman becomes mayor of Detroit. A 29-year-old Black woman becomes, a cop in Dallas. I mean, literally. And so I would make these 29-year-old Black women have a dad who had just gotten out of prison. Because it was like, well, that's my story. I can write into this thing I'm trying to figure out. So that was one way that it happened when I was, but then, I went through another breakup, the one that's in the show. And I was like, by this time I'm like a co-EP level. So what I do when I go through a breakup is I go to Paris. Okay. And I sit and I write my little butt off and then I shop or whatever. I'm sorry, I sound super bougie, but I'm very lucky. This is the dream for me.
To be bougie.
Yes, the dream is, I'm like, my first dream was to be middle class and then my next dream was to be bougie, yes. So I go there and every day I wake up and I write for 3 hours and then I walk around. And I wrote Unprisoned in that circumstance. And because I was like, I'm still trying to work out how this relationship with this man who loved me but couldn't show up was affecting all these choices I was making, And so, it's like you just lean into your circumstances and that is going to be the most interesting quote material. It's not material though. It's just your life. You're just writing it. And it's the one thing no one else can do. And you have no your job security, especially in AI, the world of AI, is going to be that intangible. What is your insight? What is your, what do you know that nobody else knows? Like, that is really where it's going to live from here on out, you know? Because AI can do the boring thing, you know? Yes. The news story.
Yes, it's the on the picket line, there's been a sign that I think has gotten a lot of press, and it's, AI doesn't have childhood trauma. And it's like, and that is exactly what we can bring that AI cannot. I actually haven't written on a crime drama of any kind, but that doesn't mean I'm not writing about my experience in that. I tend to be writing for a lot of complicated male figures, and it is both my dad and my stepdad. And my stepdad, who is a cop was a cop, but he was a good cop because he thought like a criminal. And
They all do.
yes, exactly. Yes, and it's like, and that, so it is like, so my dad being an actual criminal, and then my stepdad, it just, they're complicated, and there's a bit of narcissism too, and I'm definitely have found myself writing for a lot of those characters and pulling out that the how I felt in certain moments, or how my mom, like the stories that have interesting family dynamics, especially with more narcissistic male characters, is exactly where I find myself. And then also, yes, in dating life, I was like, I'm dating my dad. I got to get out of this and never again. And I've found someone who isn't like my dad. So that's a good thing. Thank you.
That's an achievement, honestly. Yeah.
Tracy, was it? I mean, obviously, you said that you had put in previous work, infused the idea of your relationship with your dad into those shows. But was it a difficult decision to actually write a series entirely about your relationship with him?
I'm going to say no, because I never in a million years dreamt it would get made. Because I'd been around a long time. I'd sold pitches every year since like 2009. And I never even got a pilot. So I'm just like, oh, okay, whatever. I'll take a check, like whatever. I was kind of jaded a little bit. I was like, and also I had already written a memoir, and again, I go back to the childbirth moment. It's like, whatever, you can see me. Part of it is a Buddhist thing for me. It's like, and I'm not claiming I'm a big Buddhist. There's just an idea in Buddhism that if I'm not who I think I am, how could I be who you think I am? So go ahead, judge. It has nothing to do with me. So my whole thing is like, transparency, there's a power in transparency. You set other people free, you set yourself free. There's nothing to hide. It doesn't matter. Everyone's flawed. And like, I can tolerate whatever is my story, whatever bad things. It's not like I'm trying to be like, only look at me from this angle. You know what I'm saying? It's like, it's okay. It's okay. So it wasn't scary. But can I say a funny thing? So I met with Bruce very early in my career. I think I hadn't even gotten my first job yet. It was probably right before my first job. You probably gave my script to Kevin Balls, who gave me my first job. But we had a meeting, and I was talking about my dad, and I was saying my dad's going to get out of prison. And I was like, yeah, and I don't know. I mean, should I let him come live with me? And you said to me, and I just remembered this right now. You said to me, oh, no, you can't do that. You were very clear that I could not have the kind of chaos. Like, I had worked so hard to create a life, and my son at that time was probably 10. I had created a life for myself that you can't, in the interest of being open-hearted or a good daughter, invite insanity and chaos into my life. Not in real life, but I could explore it safely in the work. So I think writing it allowed me to process it without having to, be real literal. I didn't have to get literal here, like where you're going to have this person who is not necessarily, who is he was an okay person in his own way. But sometimes I think, maybe I was in a pretend relationship with my dad. Like, maybe he wasn't there and I made it up. Do you know what I'm saying? Because he was in the phone.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he died in January. And in my mind, he's kind of still in the phone. I don't know where he is. He's like wherever he's been. And the other day I was like, oh God, I may have, there's this term called a fantasy bond where you have a fantasized relationship with a figure, a parent figure. You imagine they were better to you than they were. And I'm like, God. So you know what? Even in death, I mean, it's still, these things continue to unfold. In fact, maybe I'll do an episode on that. Thanks, room. It's going on the board. It's going on the board.
I gotta say, I'm blown away that we had that conversation, which is like, wow, how life comes full circle. It's really amazing. So I've been enjoying your show, and early in the early episodes, Delroy is he cooks, and he cooks very well. And he applies for a job at a restaurant, and he seemingly gets the job, and you know, you're feeling like, oh, good. Like I was, kind of like, oh, yeah. And then next thing you know, the manager comes around the next day and tells him, I'm so sorry, but the company has a policy where we can't hire ex-felons. And you know, and obviously it's a moment for him, but I'm curious as to how you're portraying kind of moments like that, the stigma of being incarcerated in the show, and how, you know, other ways that will be seen in the series.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is just real things that happened. That the job thing is really, you can't be independent without a job, and the system is so stacked. The job is the whole thing for my dad. That is always what led back to the life. You know, a terrible catch-22. And if we could reduce that stigma even a little bit, like, I'm not very activist per se, but I do what I do. You do what you can do, and this is what I can do. Is I just wanted America to fall in love. Because if you met my dad, you'd be like, well, what a nice man. You would just be like, he's so great. You would never know he was a criminal. He doesn't come off that way. And so I wanted America to fall in love with a career criminal, and I wanted to humanize that, and I wanted to show all the people around it. It's not just this one person. It's every person. And all the press that we've done, so many people are like, wait, that's my story. That's my story. My dad, this one, you know, my brother, my uncle, because it's just part of our country. We just throw people in jail, and like, that's it. It's a terrible situation.
But it's very specific, I think, also to people of color and communities of color, because I feel like these stories, you know, it's in television, we're in a moment where we're able to expand our vocabulary about what being a criminal is, and that you know, that doesn't necessarily define the totality of a person. And I feel like a lot of times in television shows that was only extended to white characters, that you weren't able to have a black character who was a criminal and you could see the full breadth of a person, that this was someone who was a father, you know, who
Tony
was a
Soprano.
husband. Yeah, exactly.
You're like, he's a hero.
You're right. You idolize that, but that was not done necessarily for black characters until like maybe The Wire, you know, where you get to see the kind of systemic issues that turn these people to crime. And the job is the whole thing. If you're in a system that has made it impossible for you in an impoverished area to make a living, and so you resort to selling drugs or any kind of crime, then you are stigmatized by the rules of being in the prison system, because when you get out of prison, you cannot vote. You may not be able to get a job. You are limited and restricted in ways that the general population has no idea about. I mean, you look at what's happening with voter registration now, and a lot of the pretense of that is like, well, you know, people who are in prison are getting out and voting, and that they shouldn't be allowed to vote. And it's like, well, why the hell not? They're citizens of this country. Why are they being denied if they've done their time? So there's so many aspects to what happens to people of color and these characters that I feel like has not been explored until recently. You know, and you know, we were talking earlier, or you mentioned earlier, George Floyd, and how the murder of George Floyd presented an opportunity for the rest of the country to finally get on board and say like, oh yeah, this does happen. For I think a vast majority of the country, people were like, no, police brutality and you're exaggerating and it's not that bad and slavery was so long ago. And what George Floyd, I think, did was enable a conversation where writers of color and people of color could say, this is what I have been talking about, and now do you see? And people have to say, yeah, I've seen it. You can't say you haven't seen it. I mean, if you didn't see it with Rodney King, it's like you had a whole other slew of problems. But now you really couldn't say you hadn't seen it. And
thank you, because that was where I was going to go next, because when George Floyd happened, there was this conversation that began, and I know I got many a call from my white friends who were like, oh, like they had never seen it before, and suddenly there it was. They couldn't deny it. It was right there, and I felt like I was a therapist all of a sudden, trying to get them through their guilt over having been totally oblivious to what has been for us every day of the week. And so I'm very curious, and also I want to make sure, like, our time. How are we on time? I forgot what our session. Okay, it's 10 minutes left of the session? Okay, because I want to make sure that people have a chance to ask questions. So, but I'm really curious about the conversations that you had with other writers and other people in the industry when George Floyd happened. Kristi, you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, George Floyd during the pandemic was a very interesting time because it also was like a confluence of, I think, 3 events. It was, I think, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, and the birder, whose name I don't remember, but thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, but those 3 things, I think, made it so it was just like, this is happening, because it's been like, systemic racism, is it really a thing? And it's like, no, it's a thing. But yes, so many phone calls, which, I mean, I was grateful for them, because at the end, it was like, finally people are seeing, people were marching, people were, the show I got staffed on, so I was staffed on Superman and Lois during the pandemic, and it was after all that. And I actually think that, I don't know, it was the first time that I had been staffed on a TV show that had, when I joined and jumped on the Zoom, it was a majority-minority room, and 1 through 5 on the call sheet, and that, like, the top, the main characters, like, because it's about Superman and his family, who are all white, and then the next characters, they weren't Black. And so usually if I was on a show that had Black people in the main cast, then you always have at least 1 writer or maybe 2 Black writers. But this one was totally mixed. And it was what you said earlier, it's a testament to the showrunner. I actually think he just picked the writers he liked the most. But I wonder if subconsciously that was maybe in his head. But I do think people started making different choices.
Great. Tracy, did you want to?
No, only that I actually went to Minneapolis in the pandemic, because my show is set in Minneapolis. I'm born and raised in Minneapolis, and it's a kind of a specific place. But I was like, oh my God, the pandemic in Los Angeles was like the apocalypse. And I had an empty nest by then, and I was like in my house 24 hours a day by myself going, holy shit. And I was like, I'm actually going to go to Minneapolis. I was already developing, and I'm going to go there, and I'm just going to move back to Minneapolis for a few months. So that's what I did. And it was a really interesting time to be there. And I went to the spot, and you could feel it. I mean, it's still a memorial. I think the street is open now, but my experience of it was very sort of firsthand, because I was in Minneapolis, and also very isolated, but yeah, it's not something I've tackled directly in the show. It's there, but I'm bad at, I don't know if I'm bad. I don't know. I shouldn't make a claim like that. I always want to stay away from something that feels like I'm not going to be able to really do this justice. So let's just tell the story I can do justice to, and know that it is tapping on that same spot, and let the audience make the connections. Yeah. I'm not going to tell you what to think or tell you how to think about this. I'm just going to give you some context. So, but maybe it's something I need to be more whatever about. That would be an interesting conversation. Next panel.
I would stay. We'll do another one. I know from the network perspective, when I was, at NBC, it was a big conversation because for so long, cop dramas always have, portrayed cops as being the heroes that are out there saving us day to day. And when George Floyd happened, I think there was a real awakening of, okay, this is not necessarily the truth. In fact, not often, but it certainly, there are these moments where it's far from the truth that law enforcement is protecting us. And so there was a real conversation as to how do we reflect that, because network television is nothing but procedurals. How do we reflect that new awakening, that new epiphany in the storytelling, and
Without it being the shield.
without it being the shield? Did any conversations?
I mean, I felt like there definitely was a feeling of like, okay, the cop show is going to die, and how can we do cop shows anymore? I mean, of course, it's not going to die. But I think what ended up happening was it made it possible for me as a writer to be even more vocal about some of these issues and to push back more, to have more of a conversation and a dialogue, because it was out there and it was no longer like just my opinion or that I was making it up and crazy about the situation and systemic racism. So I think it opened up a dialogue. The thing that I do worry about, though, is that in some cases it's still performative. In a lot of cases now we have new tropes that have been added to the cop show, which is, okay, now you're going to have the episode where the black man gets pulled over and it looks like it's going to go. So we've added to the kind of stereotypes. And I think that we can still go deeper into these things. And that takes some pushing. It's stuff that's harder to do on network television and still even harder to do on streaming. I feel like there's more conversations and deeper places that we can go.
Can I say something really quick? When I first started, my very first agent, I think I must have given him, I had a version of this, and he was like, I'm not going to say who he is, but he was like, you will never be able to have a black man be the lead.
Oh, yeah.
On a TV show. Yep. And I was like, he was just so, it had never occurred to me, wait, you're right. I have never seen a black man be the lead. And the only reason, I shouldn't say this, but I think the only reason my show is on the air in a world of IP, in a world of tentpole IP, is because of Kerry Washington and because of Onyx, which is Tara Duncan. And it's like, which, credit to Disney and the Disney ecosystem. They did something forward after George Floyd that was meaningful, and our show is part of it. And without all those factors, we would not be seeing this nuanced story about a black family after mass incarceration.
Well, I'll just say quickly, the reason I wrote my memoir, The Officer's Daughter, is because I tried to pitch it as a television show. And I was told to my face, the networks will never do a show about a black family. Can you make them white? And I was like, no, this is about my dad. I'm not going to change it. So I was like, fuck that, I'm going to write a memoir. But and this was pre-Empire. And everyone said, you cannot do a show about a black family. No one's going to buy this.
Mine was in 2008.
So. I back then too. My mom's family was very instrumental in the Underground Railroad. One of my great uncle is a guy named William Still, who's considered the father of the Underground Railroad. And I pitched the idea. I was like, I had this whole world planned out and all this stuff. And my agents were like, people aren't doing black stuff. Is basically what they said. And then years later, they're like, Oprah's doing a show called Underground, and William Still is a character on it. And I was like, are you kidding me? Like, that's my family. It's not even like, So here we are.
Yeah. But that's why it's important to have esteemed women like my panelists who have risen up the ranks and are getting to a position where they can make decisions and they can really impact the storytelling that's happening. And Tara Duncan was mentioned. Tara Duncan is the head of Onyx Media, which is a division of Disney. And so when you have a black woman in charge, guess what? you can actually get some progress made in terms of the storytelling.
And Tara was at Netflix before, and she was instrumental in getting Self-Made, the story of Madam C.J. Walker done, which is a show I co-show ran, and it's because of Tara.
She's amazing. And she's the president of Freeform.
Yeah.
And they give me so much latitude. Like sometimes I'm like, damn, I'm like Paul Thomas Anderson. I'm like, I want to do a dance off. Oh, I want to do that. And they'll be like, oh, okay. And I'm like, is this because my network president is a black woman? I'm like, because no one has not noted me to death, you know, my whole career.
It's so exciting for me to see Tara and to see Perlina Obokwe, who's the president of Universal Studios, Television Studios, and Channing Dungey, who's the head of Warner Brothers Television. So, like, having those women in those positions is just really inspiring and really gives me hope for the future. So, you know, with that, I'm going to open up to some questions because I'm sure you probably have some. So, go ahead. We're close enough. You can just yell it out.
Okay, this is a great perspective. So I'm going to quickly go over my prison experience, which is my mom. I'm an only child. My mom's an only child. My grandma was an only child. My biological father owned nightclubs and I recently learned, shot in a drive-by shooting from outside of his nightclubs.
I'm so sorry.
And then my mother dated a man who was constantly imprisoned. In and out and in and out, and then we finally moved away. I raised my mom. She didn't raise me. And so the character of every person that's in prison has at least a circle of people around them that is also impacted by this. And so developing those people is something I'd love to hear about. And the people that are also in, like, on the flip side, I'm a military spouse's best friend. So that's another level of auxiliary interest. So it's fascinating. Yeah.
I mean, that was the idea. It was like, we do spend a lot of time on the criminals and the cops, but we never really have seen, because here's what I'll say. I was a foster child because my dad was in prison. The foster care system and the incarceration system are like analogs. It's like foster care is prison for children. You know what I mean? I'm putting hashtags, you know, hash marks up on the wall just like my dad is. My whole thing is tied to him. You know, every time he comes out, then I come out. And then I go back, and then I go back, and he goes back, and then I go back. And so this alone is like a huge connection that I had never seen really made in media, because I don't think, like, we get these like fantasy versions of foster care, or like and the one thing I really wanted to do was to make a hero, not an anti-hero. That's the other thing. Every time I'm seeing like people in this world, they're anti-heroes and they behave in ways that I don't behave. I'm like, no, I care. I care a lot about everything. I'm like, I watch people on TV. I'm like, how are they doing? She just fucked the pizza guy and didn't even care. I'm like, I'd be in love with the pizza guy now. I'm like, wow, can we have a relationship? Where's our relationship? You know what I mean? So I just wanted to see people who are trying really hard to love each other despite all this, you know, systematic oppression and their own stuff that they're dealing with. Because there's a certain amount of, I don't want to call it self-loathing, but like generational trauma, the way it manifests is by ways that you behave that are not in your own best interest, you know? And so how do we really get into that and do a human, like really get into it and go, no, she's not behaving in ways that are good for her a lot of the time.
Well, I think also it's a testament to the writing on your show. You're writing from character. I think when you start in a lot of shows, if you're only starting with plot and you're like, oh, I want this cool thing to happen and how can I make this plot point happen or this set piece happen, it's not coming from character. It's not coming from a place of these are real human beings. Yeah, an interior place. It's coming from an exterior. I want to move the structure of this show in such a way that we build to this act break. And it's not building out of the characters. And I think that if you're writing something, you need to think about what are the characters really going to do, not what the structure of the piece is. And, you know, I want to have this tremendous moment and I'm building to that instead.
I feel like most protagonists in television are avoidant attachment strategists. Okay. Like they're all on the avoidant side. And that's because I think a lot of creators are on the avoidant side, because avoidant is like bulletproof. You're just like super, like nothing affects me. And that gets you far in our business. But I wanted to do an anxiously attached female protagonist, because especially female protagonists, they are all bulletproof. And I'm like,
Yeah, I hate the trope in television. This used to happen a lot in pilots where the main character would be in bed with a guy and she didn't know his name, and it was kind of like okay for her, and then she goes to work and that's her boss. I'm like, if I see that one more time, I'm gonna shoot myself. I hate that. It's like, who acts like that? I don't know a woman who acts like that.
I don't either. I mean, I know a couple, actually.
Let's get some other questions before we could go on all night with that.
Other questions for the panelists?
Come on, friends. You have time.
Okay, we got one in the back.
Well, I'm noticing there's more on TV, and Will Trent is really focusing on foster care system, and I think he's Hispanic, I'm not sure, but anyway, I'm starting to see more about the foster care system. Is that something that needs to be skewed more towards maybe the African American community, or what?
I don't know. I feel like, I think what I need to see is not the after school special version of something, not the external, like I'm standing out here looking at these interesting creatures in foster care. You know what I'm saying? I think the best storytelling is what Elle was saying. It's like when it's internal. And what we haven't seen in these kinds of marginalized groups is, I mean, I don't know, how many foster children have gotten shows on the air? I mean, it could be, I'm in a sample of one. You know what I'm saying?
I did work for a show called The Fosters,
Right.
which was really, which was about
People love that show.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it just was groundbreaking in terms of looking at LGBTQ issues, and, you know, the lesbian couple, that one of the parents was a cop. So that, you know, that kind of pulled in a little procedural element that I think made people feel comfortable. But it was about foster care kids. And one of the interesting things for me was the research that we did going to foster homes and just being like, this is really messed up. Like this system is broken.
And I mean, I had bad ones and good. I had one great one. And also I was in Minnesota, and they're like legit socialists up there, especially when I was growing up. Like, so you couldn't do better than to end up in foster care in Minneapolis in the 70s. That's it. That's the top. That's the Harvard of foster care. But you know, I don't know. Was the creator of that show a foster?
No, the creator was not. But
And where did that come from for them?
You know,
Someone had an idea.
You know, tell us.
What was it?
I actually know the answer to that.
'Cause it's Peter
the
Page.
executive at Disney was a foster child.
Who?
Ambrose. And he recently wrote a book actually about his growing up. He was homeless with his mom for years. And so he was integral in getting that show. I don't know if
interesting.
he developed it, but he was integral in getting that show.
Yeah.
And heard and eventually on the air. Because a lot of it has to do with
It's so important to have advocacy and having somebody push the ball up the boulder up the hill. And so often we're put in the position to have to do that. And thank God that, you know, we're still here and we've managed to do that many a time, but it's a struggle. It really is. And go ahead, Kate.
Let her, I was going to ask a question.
Oh, did you have a question?
Oh, I was just going to ask if you could do anything different in your careers, what would it be?
I wouldn't do anything different.
So the challenges and the struggles, you'd still live those right now.
Yeah.
Making different decisions, I guess.
No, well, I didn't even start writing TV till I was 42. So I had already had a whole career as a television news writer. So I feel like this was my doing it different career, you know, and where I was able to take a lot more risks and really kind of commit to my own point of view. And, you know, something happens as a woman, you turn 40 and you're like, oh, okay. And then you turn 50 and you're like, oh, okay. I am so excited. Because I'm like, I think it just keeps going, but yeah. I think the thing is like, if there's something on your heart and you really want to do it, you just gotta just hold that space and let the universe create itself around your intention. And amazing things can happen that you cannot even imagine. Like, how in the heck did all this unfold? But once I got aligned with that, then yeah, there's nothing I would change, because it's like you're aligned with this higher thing, and everything you do becomes aligned with that higher thing. So I feel like you just commit to the what and forget about the how, and let the how take care of itself, and it will.
Yeah, I wouldn't change anything about my actual journey, but if I could, I guess, give advice to baby writer Kristi, it would be, I guess, just trust your voice. Because I think sometimes when you're coming up, and especially when you are the one in a room, one woman, the one Black person, the one whatever, you second guess sometimes, and you get in your head. And also, I have to say, as a woman, I noticed that a lot of you would speak up, and it would be as if no one heard you. Yeah. You're like, did I whisper? Did I whisper? And then someone else will repeat the same thing. Same thing. And everyone's like, yeah, great idea. So in one way, it was like, oh, that feels, I was totally ignored, or maybe they just didn't hear me. But then the other way was validation, because it was like, I had a good idea. And the more I started to gain confidence, the more I think my statements in the room ended less with, and what about this? Like it going up.
Or this is a bad idea, but.
Yeah, exactly. Because when you preface that, they just they tune you right out. And I think I actually think my voice maybe got a little lower too, as I gained confidence and people started hearing me. But I would definitely tell baby writer Kristi, like, trust your voice, speak up. It doesn't matter if you're the token, just, the token has spoken. Just make sure that it's out there, and trust your gut, because you're in that room for a reason, even if you're the one.
Well, we are unfortunately out of time. God knows we could speak about this for a year. We've just scratched the surface, but I'm so thankful to these amazing women that I've been on this podium with. It's truly just an honor for me. And so I'm going to wrap it up. I would also thank Hollywood Health and Society again for sponsoring this. They're an amazing organization that really provides Hollywood with true facts about so many issues, and we're so thankful to you. And I just want to add also that later today, there'll be a happy hour entitled Do the Right, WRITE, Do the Right Thing Happy Hour, in honor of BIPOC creatives. So please check your schedules and join everyone for that happy hour. And thank you so much for coming. We so appreciate it.